So Arctic urban sustainability research just means focus on cities in the Arctic. What we're looking at is a comparison of cities from Russia, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Alaska. Not yet Iceland, unfortunately, but possibly Greenland as well. Essentially, our question is, how do you preserve the environment as well as the quality of life for future generations in consideration of things like industrial development in the Arctic, especially in terms of mining, which affects the environment and also affects people's lives in the long run. So that's what we define sustainability to be, is how do you preserve the environment for future generations? In essence, what we are asking is, in the face of things like climate change, industrialization of the Arctic, globalization, as well as migrations into Arctic cities, how will governments, especially local city governments, how will they affect policies in order for sustainability to continue over time? Let's say from now to 2030 to 2050. So these are the questions that, in fact, that we've been asking people here in Yakutsk. Yakutsk is a good case example because it is undergoing major changes such as climate change, but also globalization and in-migration of people. Yakutsk is now 320,000 people, and it's possible that by 2050 it will be 400,000 people. So how do you plan for that in the future? And these are questions that we're asking of cities also, such as Norilsk and Murmansk, as well as Tromsø in northern Norway, and Rovaniemi in northern Finland, and Luleå in Sweden, and other cities across the circumpolar Arctic. In essence, what we're trying to do is to get policymakers to be thinking about these major issues, because by 2050, most of the world's populations will live in cities. And so how do you feed populations in the Arctic especially? So some of the other issues that our interviewees here in Yakutsk are expanding on or showing us in terms of how they make policy is things like food security. How do you feed populations, not just by bringing food in from far away, but by growing your own food or by harvesting local food. I know Yakutsk has an experiment of having hothouses and greenhouses, growing tomatoes at the moment, but in the future it might be also growing cucumbers and jokingly today somebody said maybe even kiwis. That may or may not happen, but the goal is to be able to feed the population in remote locations in the Arctic. And this is also happening in places like Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And a lot of that is happening through urban gardens. Again, most people even in Arctic cities are concerned about getting food from local sources rather than having very, very expensive food being brought from the south. And indeed, as we know, even in the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, food in the high north, in the Arctic, is very, very expensive compared to even Yakutsk. And it's that same thing in Canada, where food in Toronto is much less expensive than food in Nunavut, for example, or Yellowknife or Whitehorse. And it's the same also for Alaska. Food is much less expensive in Washington, D.C. or New York City than it is in places like Barrow, for example. And so food security is one of the major questions. The other thing, and there are many, there are about 5 issues that we encountered today in terms of sustainability of Arctic cities. The other thing is transportation, and that feeds into, forgive the pun, into the idea of how you bring food, but also people into certain areas in a place such as Yakutia. How do you travel from one place, from one city to another? And that has to do with road building, that has to do with the provision of infrastructure. Even within cities, that's a question. Should you have a much more robust busing system, for example? In a place like Yakutsk, it's not an option to have a metro, of course, because you have permafrost. But these are a lot of the questions that are being asked by city governments and as well as local population. Because it's very, very expensive to own a car in many places in the Arctic, and more because it uses fossil fuel, it's not an option for many communities. In other parts of the Arctic, it's not so much yet happening in the Russian Arctic. There's also consideration of alternative energies. In northern Norway, for example, more and more of our electricity comes from wind power. And of course, it has historically come from hydropower as well. In places like northern Canada, it can come from solar cells, and I guess they're experimenting with that a little bit here in Yakutia as well. And so the reason behind that is that we want to get away from the use of fossil fuels because it is a resource that is running out. So oil and gas will no longer be the predominant energy source as we move from now, from 2017 to 2030 to 2050. By 2050, it's very, very possible that your children and my grandchildren will not even know how to use gasoline or gas in order to power our cars or to heat our homes. What we'll be mostly using will probably be solar power or wind power or hydropower. But there are other options as well. In one of our interviews today, of course, the possibility of atomic power was put on the table. That is, of course, very, very controversial, especially in places like Sweden, where they are rejecting atomic nuclear power more and more. But these are options that are available away from fossil fuels. And the reason why we want to get away from that is, of course, because it leads to pollution worldwide. It leads to climate change. It leads to carbon being emitted in the atmosphere, and therefore that leads to the rise in temperature across the world. And that, of course, feeds into the fact that places like Norilsk or Yakutsk, they have permafrost. And therefore, if that melts, it will be disastrous consequences for many of the people who live there, but also for the industries and traditional economies and cultures that are in these regions. And so, for those of us who live in Norway and live on the coast, it will also mean sea level rise, and that will have major consequences for coastal communities. It's already happening in the northern part of Alaska, where you have small cities sinking into the ocean because thawing permafrost. So these are the questions that are really on the minds of city governments. The other thing that is extant, or that is very important now, especially in Arctic cities, is that of capacity building. Yakutsk doesn't have a problem with this. You have a university, but other places in northern Canada, for example, there are no universities. You have small colleges, and most of the education that comes into those places are through the internet. And so these are the things that have to be solved by local governments. So why is it important to have capacity building in places like the Arctic? It's so that people stay in places that may not have access to better jobs, or may not have access to better education. If you have a university, if you have an opportunity to have university courses, then the likelihood is that those communities will develop their own industries. And most of that will be from high-tech or knowledge industries, or even cultural industries, not so much resource extraction as we have seen historically in most of these places, whether that's oil and gas, whether that's mining. I think more and more the Arctic will move away from these extractive industries because they are pollutants in the long run, which feeds into climate change, and then which again feeds into the ice melt in the Arctic, which is a crucial question for many Arctic cities. The other thing that is incredibly important for cities in the Arctic is citizenship engagement. So how do you ask people who live in Arctic cities what they want and how they want to live in the future? by 2030, by 2050, how do these people envision, how do these residents who live in Yakutsk or Murmansk or Norilsk or Tromsø or Luleå or Rovaniemi, how do they envision their futures? And for the most part, they do have a vision of how they want to live in the future, whether that's in a multicultural city that is very, very robust. It may not have the population of a New York City or a Los Angeles or a Moscow, but for the most part, should have a population that replenishes itself, that produces culture, that produces education, and that produces knowledge. And so for the most part, Arctic cities, apart from, I guess, some of what the rest of the world thinks of Arctic cities, are actually quite robust and cosmopolitan places. And we see that also in a place like Yakutsk. I'm using that as a reference right now because we are in Yakutsk, but the number of restaurants that are here, the fact that I can use internet anywhere I go in the city, all of these infrastructure services that a city can offer can be offered in an Arctic city. And I think most people who live in the South, whether that's Brussels or Paris or Washington, D.C., they have this idea of Arctic cities as being a little bit backward, that we don't have or we don't aspire to all of these comforts or amenities that a big city might have, such as world-class restaurants or world-class transportation systems or world-class communication systems such as internet. So places, let's just take Yakutia as an example, places outside of Yakutsk city, small villages, more and more of those people will migrate to the centers, just because it's easier to get hold of education, as well as it's just generally easier to live. Better apartments, better heating, better infrastructure, better amenities. So again, in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that Arctic cities will only become much more important in the governments of Arctic states. And Arctic city governance itself will determine how Arctic peoples live in the future.